Yeah, so this is a coronavirus special for Dilemma. I don't know. So just first off, are you okay? How are you doing? I feel like nobody's asking that enough to each other.
I'm fine. I'm taking
Mm,
precautions, but I'm not super anxious. The thing is, I was worried about this before it was cool.
yeah,
Because
I
I'm a
know you were.
hipster.
I think in one of the episodes you made a joke and I sort of just like played it off. But yeah, you were like it was a joke about like what if what if this is the one that takes us down. You were ahead. I guess you were keeping an eye on it. Where did you first learn about it? You saw like videos coming around the internet or something like in January. People were
Yeah,
starting to
I think
whisper about
yeah,
this.
yeah. I heard the New York Times Daily podcast about the Wuhan,
Oh,
the Wuhan situation, and I was on the subway looking at rats scuttle around on the subway while listening to a podcast about a virus, derived from bats in Wuhan, and
yeah,
this overwhelming creepiness came over me.
yeah,
And the moment it seemed like it could come here, I kind of shut
yeah,
everything down. But so I'm emotionally over that part. I think I got through that
yeah,
phase quicker.
yeah. So what maybe I don't know where we start with this one. I don't know if you've written things down. I have a few things written down, but I guess as co-host of a podcast that's all about moral philosophy and sometimes seemingly outrageous hypotheticals of moral dilemmas and situations that we think we'll never be in, and just sort of seeing how our philosophy bounces off of those things, it seems to me that we're all now living in a giant trolley problem, and everybody has a different dilemma that is very salient to them now. I've noticed a lot. I wanted to start the conversation. I'm curious the ones in particularly that you've sort of seen pop up in your social circle or in conversations. Everybody's having these conversations, I'm sure. I don't know if we can help at all. I don't want to panic anybody. It's actually one of the dilemmas that I have about too much information and when it's good to where that line is. I think we're probably all struggling with that, but the first place that I wanted to start with is what is becoming so this isn't like a new particular problem with something like coronavirus, but this overarching problem that we're always in about people who worry about things like existential risk or future events is the problem of not being able to live in a counterfactual universe. Meaning that if you are super concerned about something that you think might happen and you happen to be right about something in the future, and you start insisting that everybody take what seem to be drastic, non-reactionary, but like overly precautious care about something with huge implications economically or inconveniencing people, and then you actually successfully avoid the disaster that you saw coming, you will always appear to everyone to have been a paranoid overreactor who wasted everybody's time and money.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you could get in a time machine right now and suddenly found yourself by some weird Twilight Zone thing, like on the Titanic, the moment that it was about to leave port, and you knew what was going to happen and started freaking out and trying to like break the engine, of course everybody would be restraining you, being like, this guy's insane. But let's say then you successfully did it and you broke the ship and everyone had to get off and they were all pissed at you, and then put you like in a mental institution. In your own mind, you're a hero who saved all these lives, but to everybody else, you will always have been a paranoid, crazy person. And so that's like a funny way just to obviously point to the psychological maybe flaw that we have of being we react very well and we don't avoid disasters very well at all, especially if it calls for things like shutting down half of the economy or whatever, which are real dilemmas to consider.
Yeah, that what you're talking about, I think of as the paradox of the worrywart. Right.
Yeah.
It's that if you my favorite example of this, which sends chills down my spine, is in David Fromm's book, Trumpocracy. He opens the book talking about imagining a politician in the 1990s who was just going on and on about, fortifying airline cockpits from potential hijackers, and would be seen as just a total worrywart and alarmist. But imagine that despite all of the pressures, pushing the other direction, like, is this cost efficient? Is this, is this worth our time, our political capital? Imagine that they were successful and they got some precautionary measures through. We don't even know what we would have been saved from. Not only 9/11, but the aftermath. That's who knows how many heroes are walking around amongst us that we just view as complete bores. We don't even know the number of things we've been saved from that we don't even know is incredible. And it's impossible to feel the way we should feel about that.
Yeah. I was having this conversation with Zara about like, do you want to, if there was a near terrorist attack that was going to blow up the subway last week and they averted it at the last minute, like, do you actually want to know that versus do you have a right to know? This is, I think, Cass Sunstein's new book coming out later this year called Too Much Information is specifically about that. Let me just read the blurb that I got, I think from the book. The blurb for Cass Sunstein's new book, which I guess is scheduled to come out September 1st. It's called Too Much Information. Is how much information is too much? Do we need to know how many calories are in a giant vat of popcorn that we bought on our way to the movie theater? Do we want to know if we are genetically predisposed to a certain disease? Can we do anything useful with next week's weather forecast for Paris if we are not even in Paris? In Too Much Information, Cass Sunstein examines the effects of information on our lives. Policymakers, so this is the salient part here. Policymakers emphasize the right to know, but Sunstein takes a different perspective, arguing that the focus should be on human well-being and what information contributes to it. Government should require companies, employers, hospitals, and others to disclose information not because of a general right to know, but when the information in question would significantly improve people's lives. This is actually, to your credit, kind of a perfect summation, it sounds like, of a consequentialist ethic applied to the notion of information. Yeah. But I'll bring this to a coronavirus question to you specifically because I kind of buy that. Obviously, I haven't read the book yet, but I kind of buy that as a guiding principle in some way. It does push against sort of this world we have of this right to know and maybe pushes against some sort of free speech absolutism. But what I worry about in it is something like, I don't know if you saw, Graham Wood put an article out maybe 4 or 5 days ago now, just doing some basic math of publicly available data of people tracking the coronavirus and where the infections were, and did this math that just extrapolated how many cases Iran must really have at the moment. And they were reporting something like, I don't know, 80,000 or something, but the actual number, unless the data of who was getting it from planes that came from Iran or whatever was just incredibly fluky, of like everybody who had coronavirus in Iran happened to be on planes, which of course, as a good statistician, you ignore flukes and assume that this is just somewhere near the middle of a graph. The actual number of cases in Iran was probably closer to 2 million, somewhere between 1 and 3 million, which was 250 times higher than what was being reported. And, he's like, check my math, everybody, but this looks like the thing. And part of me, I looked at the article and I was like, oh, crap, like, wow. And then also immediately thought of this argument of like, is this going to instill panic? Or, of course, the counter is like, is this going to get people to actually take it seriously? Which I don't know if that works. I don't know how you respond to that, this level of like, do we actually really want to know what's out there? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the question it comes down to is how much do we trust human rationality? Because if we're trusting the human mind or the median human mind to react appropriately to information, then the simplest thing is just give us the information and we'll naturally be able to sort what's relevant from what's not. And I think that, on the other hand, there are people who think, humans are perfectly irrational and, we would need to curate all information so that we don't do something crazy. And I remember in Cass Sunstein's last book, it's hard to know what he writes so many so quickly. So many. Sometime in his last 5 books, he made this point that there are times when policymakers should not be transparent about how they come to make their policies, because they need to have conversations that are politically incorrect in order to come to the right answers. So like his whole thing is cost benefit calculus. When, smart policy wonks at the CDC are coming up with a recommendation, they might have to reason in ways that are like fundamentally ugly. They might have to be calculating how many life years are gained from saving a 65-year-old person as opposed to a baby. Just reason in ways that are kind of icky to the average person. And if we mandated that we have a transcript of their conversation for transparency's sake, it might sort of, that's what I understand Cass Sunstein's argument to have been. And I think that's so persuasive up to a point. You just have to find out what situations are like that and what aren't. The truth, of course, is that humans are neither perfectly rational nor perfectly irrational. We have a strong tendency toward reason, but strong biases that make us very irrational and prone to panic. And it's really hard to figure out where the line is, how to thread the needle between sowing panic and giving people useful information with which they can address this crisis.
And even to maybe throw even more complication into that, you're at Columbia, you could give me sort of the report from what it looks like from the younger 20s crowd. But I don't know if I'm making this up or not. It's getting some play in the media now that younger people aren't taking it seriously or nearly as seriously. There's the obvious, well, they're not in like the high risk demographic. But I also wonder, with this too much information kind of thesis and conversation, is it also a bit of a trust problem in media and maybe government sources about crying wolf so many times? I remember, just as a anecdote, growing up, I was born in 82, and I remember growing up watching the TV. If you were flipping channels and you happened to come across a news channel where the breaking news graphic was on with the music, that was like a big fucking deal. And you would stop, you would watch it. Even as a kid, you knew this was important. You would call your parents down to watch it. And it was always a big deal. I have a very vivid memory of seeing the breaking news graphic with the start of the first Gulf War and this shot of green night vision bombs flying everywhere. And it was a big deal. And now it's hard to walk by a screen for the last 10 years in an airport without seeing breaking news. It could be like breaking news, Meghan Markle sneezed or something. And it's like, is there also a bit of a sort of, they don't take it seriously because they've been told everything is the end of the world. And now when it is actually a pretty serious situation, there's no wolf to cry anymore because they already used it.
I'm not sure if the crying wolf is the main reason, although I think it could be true that like big picture, we just react to news less. Like, it was World War III, 2 months ago? And that went out of the news in a week, but no one who was crying it was World War III really registered that we came down from that cliff emotionally. They just kind of came down from it and weren't reflective enough to be like, oh, we freaked out. But as far as coronavirus and the idea that young people aren't taking it seriously, that seems plainly true to me. I mean, I walked on Columbia's campus yesterday expecting people to be distancing themselves, at least like 3 feet from the next person. Not even close. The weather was nice, not even that nice, like high 50s, which was enough reason for just like dozens and dozens, probably well over 100 people to gather on the lawns and the steps and just hang out in tight knit groups, standing shoulder to shoulder, hugging each other, just like playing football.
Yeah.
Which is like
passing.
Yeah. It's like past the coronavirus vector.
Yeah,
everyone. And I was so, I've been so immersed in reading, the Twitter feed and reading articles about it that I expected other people to be also taking it seriously. But they're just not. I mean, here's the other thing I realized is that I think people like me and probably you to some degree, you're maybe a bit more extroverted than I am. I actually don't know. The point is,
I don't know either.
People who like being on Twitter and like getting information, Infowars, policy wonk, we're kind of more comfortable with social distancing by nature. Yeah. Because a lot of us do it already, but if you're a typical person who like really gets energy from being around people and, you know, is not an infovore type, social distancing is actually a very big emotional burden. And there's virtually no payoff if you're young. So just the simple theory of humans being selfish creatures predicts that young people, you know, for the most part would not care. And that's exactly what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. And so I want to get into some of the more difficult, outlandish kind of situations that maybe we could have done. So Robin Hansen, someone who you really turned me on to, has been, I think, we also just got to say, like, this coronavirus pandemic thing is like kind of a statistician's dream and a social scientist's dream of like the kind of data that is going to come out of what happens here is fascinating to study. So there's this perverse kind of interest for people like Robin Hansen of like, oh, how do people react? What can we learn here? He was also very early on in this thing and knew it was coming. He did the math. He suggested, kind of facetiously, but looking back on it now, may have been a really interesting answer of we should be intentionally infecting our first responder and healthcare workers, you know, like a month ago. So inevitably, when the curve started going up here, we would have people to work, and we wouldn't be so overwhelmed. The obvious like ethics of that. I mean, intentionally versus how many would just volunteer. I don't know, raises a lot of questions, but playing it back, this is the kind of counterfactual thing. He'd be the guy on the Titanic being like, you're insane. We're putting you in a straitjacket. And if it had worked, like, then he still would have been considered insane just in his own mind. He could show you all the math and been like, look, I saved all these lives, but people don't respond to math and numbers. We just know that. We clearly know that now, but they respond to lives. That, talking about flattening the curve, it seems to be, just to throw this out there, I'm sure you've been reading all this stuff. The fatality rate is this number that everybody keeps trying to put their finger on, and no one can really quite do it. But we seem to be honing in on some decent data because we have these different countries kind of handling it differently. Like the data from South Korea is really, really good because they're testing like everybody. And then you could just sort of extrapolate the fatality rate they have there. But it seems to be the fatality rate hovers, again, don't get your information from me, go to the CDC or whatever, but 3 to 4% for countries that are like overwhelmed, and then can drop all the way down to like 0.6 or 0.7 or something for countries that are, or situations that are like pretty well prepared, and the curve is generally flat, which is also horrifying because that just tells you, like, I'm just doing the math in my head, like 75% or something of the deaths of this thing are actually pretty preventable if you had taken precaution, which is horrifying. So back to Robin's proposition, you tell me what you think about it. I love the way he thinks there. That would be a way to maybe not demand such crazy shutdown, lockdown, closing things because your healthcare system is harder. It's just more resilient because you have more people in it. And we should have been building hospitals maybe a month ago. I don't know.
So if you think about his idea, it's not that different than just normal immunities, like normal shots, right?
Yeah.
It is in a few important ways. One would be probably, if you're injecting healthcare workers with the virus, some very small percentage of them might die from it. And at the time Robin was writing that, I don't think we knew enough, and still don't know enough, about the virus to really, do it safely, inject people with it safely. Although I hear, there are some labs offering, $500 or $1,000 for people to voluntarily get injected with it so that they can help speed up the process of a vaccine. But yeah, I mean, you have to imagine in his hypothetical that like we have enough to vaccinate healthcare workers, but not the general population.
Right.
Which I guess is,
and it wasn't even vaccinate. I think at the time he was suggesting just expose them to it, so they're immune, get it and then get over it, and then build up sort of antibodies and immunities, assuming it doesn't mutate.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other assumption. That's another important assumption. We don't really know that it's not going to mutate, and I don't think we know yet that you can't get it twice.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So his suggestion may have been impractical.
Yeah, definitely impractical,
Yeah.
but not great. Not like, I don't think you should dismiss it out of hand.
No. And if the economy tanks badly, I mean, what's so interesting about this one also, I think someone we referenced a lot here, and I'm going to again soon, Sam Harris, who I've worked with, keeps calling it a dress rehearsal. And it's a good, if this is a dress rehearsal for a much worse one, I'm fascinated by if we will learn anything from this experience or have learned from our mistakes yet at all. Maybe that's something we do next time. I have no idea. I don't know.
I think I agree with him that it's a dress rehearsal. I mean, it's serious and we should take it seriously, obviously. But you can just imagine, like, with small changes in the virus, how much worse it could be. Yeah. Obviously, if it were an order of magnitude more deadly, that's the obvious one. But even if it were just as deadly, but instead of targeting elder people, it targeted children, I think people would be absolutely ballistic. Right now. And
which is kind of terrible of just the way that we
it's horrible.
Consider old people
dispensable
in society as like all of the tweets and comments of like, they're in their 80s. It's like, holy shit, dude. Like, what the fuck? These are people.
Heather McDonald wrote a column yesterday just saying, most of the people are dying are above 70 and, they didn't have long to live anyway. Tossing old people out in half a sentence. I certainly hope when I'm that age, I'm not viewed as so dispensable. In fairness, there's an obvious point to make about like length of years left. That's not a crazy consideration or a callous consideration. But every time someone says the virus is, quote, not that deadly, you're smuggling in a young person's perspective. It's quite deadly from the perspective of an older person or even a young immunocompromised person. Yeah.
So this brings up, I wanted to like shift to this conversation of, I don't know the philosophical term for this. There must be one, or psychological one, but this notion of invisible responsibility. I mean, it comes up everywhere. This isn't like a novel concept here, but all the famous quotes of like ethical, what's this one by ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even when doing the wrong thing is legal. This whole like an ethical person is the one who gives charity anonymously, all that kind of stuff. We consider this to be kind of the highest moral good because it's removing kind of the social points you get and the status points you get from doing it. It's doing it for the sake of doing it on itself. When no one's watching, you did the right thing. There's like an inverse of that, of course, of you can do the wrong thing if it's invisible and nobody will notice and nobody will see, and you're much more likely to do that. When it comes to a virus that nobody can see, you have this opportunity to as we're finding out, it's very likely, actually, given the data, that people who are totally asymptomatic and may never know they even have had it and spread it to people who are very vulnerable. I may have had it. So I'm sharing some of that invisible responsibility. And if somebody who is connected to me dies, or I had dinner with friends actually at their apartment yesterday. It was just the four of us, and we drove, or we walked, but we walked with social distancing and all that. If like somebody that they know dies of it, I'm gonna wonder like, shit, did that come from me? And it's always impossible to know. But I wonder, what I'm getting at is, I wonder if one of the interesting things that's coming out of this is a kind of social shaming that actually can work, because people we're not changing their behavior based on, as we're pointing out, like ethical, like to actually care about old people. What are you doing? But wouldn't you feel just incredible shame for causing death? Even inadvertently. Yeah. But I don't know if you follow this Patient 31 thing in South Korea.
I was about to bring that up.
Yeah, that's the one I'm sure we're all thinking of. Patient 31, for people who are listening who haven't heard it, it seemed like South Korea was kind of getting a handle on this thing, and then this explosion in this of cases like came out of this one area, and they tracked it back to this one person, Patient 31, who, if I'm getting the story right, was told she had it, and then like went and sort of ignored doctor's orders to stay isolated and went to church, and then went to like a buffet. And like thousands of cases were tracked back to her. You just do the numbers, and that's like, potentially 100 people dead because of her, or more, whatever it spreads. That's like I don't know. I'm not a lawyer here, a criminal lawyer. It's bordering on like involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment. I really wonder also about the legality of this thing. We could just talk, let's set aside the legal questions, because I think Florida is actually also suing China, which is interesting. But
the state of Florida is suing China?
Yeah, something like, I think Boca Raton actually specifically, because they're all old people. And that's an interesting case of like the early days of mismanaging it. You unleash this upon should China feel any moral responsibility or shame for the way that they failed in this case? But let's just talk about someone like patient 31 and the usefulness of public shaming in this case to make sure here in America, we haven't really had a patient 31. There was this one guy who flew on the plane from New York, who was a doctor or something, and had it, or maybe knew he had it or whatever, he's also getting shamed. I think there's something about the usefulness of shaming here that we don't talk a lot about, the positive aspects of shame and just admitting how much we care about our status in society that might actually be, I don't know, useful here and pointed towards ethical ends.
So shaming is definitely an important part of the story of how we're going to get people to social distance, by making them feel bad for not doing it. At the same time, I do think there just is a limit sort of baked into human nature with many people when it comes to how selfish they are. I guess it's like a tragedy of the commons type problem where, everyone pursuing their own, what makes sense for them personally, young people. It really doesn't make sense to social distance. Like, say, that girl I like is asking me to hang out on the lawn of Columbia. Am I really going to say, well, actually, no, I'm going to stay home rather than take this chance to, it's just a million decisions like that, So there's a limit to that,
and
but
the impossibility that it'll ever be really traced back to you. You'll always have the trapdoor in your head. Like that patient 31 could be like, come on, they probably had it already. Or like, you can't prove it was me.
So with patient 31, so my understanding of what happened with her is that she was not especially irresponsible. I mean, she was perhaps a little bit irresponsible. But what I understand happened is that her church congregation had some practices that were almost designed to spread viruses. And so her just participating in the normal practice of church led her to spread it to literally over 1,000 people. And I see that as more of an example of moral luck, which I don't know if have we talked about that on the show before?
We've brought up the term. I don't think we've ever really dissected it.
I think it's I think it's Thomas Nagel's coinage. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the example he gives is just walking and you step on an ant or something, and just take it as a given that that's an unethical thing to do. You're stepping on an ant was a matter of luck, because the act of walking is something we're all doing all the time. But it's just pure luck whether you end up harming someone. Or another instance would be you punch someone in the face and that person has a condition that if they get any significant amount of trauma to their head, they die instantly.
Right.
Lots of people punch people in the face, but few of them kill them on contact. So, in that case, you're getting prosecuted for murder or something like that. But really, as a moral agent, you are no worse than the guy who got into a bar fight. And so patient 31 in South Korea, viewed purely in terms of the consequences she wrought on that country, killed many, many people. At the same time, I think a lot of other coronavirus patients have probably behaved in a similar way and spread it to far fewer.
Just got lucky.
Pure dumb luck.
Just got lucky. Yeah.
So I have sympathy for her.
Yeah. Me too. But there is maybe there's a way, instead of that's a really good edit, because I actually don't know her story that detailed, because maybe there's an edit to me focusing on shame and that we should all be shaming her, of almost the look how tragic this is, and that it kind of is going to weigh on her conscience forever, which might be unfair, but it's just going to. And don't you want to avoid that? So maybe you ought to if you're just feeling a little sniffles or something, don't go to a buffet. Like maybe there's a way to turn that without sort of shaming herself, or even Florida suing China behaving the way they did. It's not like they're the only country that did that. Did they get unlucky somehow that they just happened to be the one that it let out? It's a good point about moral luck versus moral shame, of like, if you're feeling a little unwell, you can by just a bad string of luck and some unfortunate event, be the one who caused, putting it that way without saying like responsible morally, the one who caused a lot of death and sadness, and you don't want that weighing on your conscience. So let's try to all be socially distant here, and we can have sympathy for the people who get unlucky and behave in, not such extremely bad ways. I mean, even the doctor who flew to Florida, I don't know all the details there. There's conflicting reports whether he knew it before, whether he knew it after, or I think I even heard like he got an email while on the plane
that's
saying
what I
that your
heard.
test was positive, which is even like, if you're waiting for a test, dude, like, maybe don't get on the plane. But I'm sure he wasn't the only one who's done that so far, and he's the unlucky one who got that. So there's some sympathy there, but there's also some like, hey, don't put yourself in a situation where you could be unlucky. There's the sports analogies here of like, athletes who, I don't even know the quotes off the top of my head, but like they don't believe in luck. They're just like being in a position to be lucky as actually the thing. So don't put yourself in obvious positions where you might be very morally unlucky, like a buffet at the moment. And you're sort of pointing to that. That might be the best way to edit that whole thing. But I wanted to talk, while we're on the topic of social media, I wanted to bring this up. I'm going to bring an anecdote in from the film I made with Sam and Majid. I might even play it. So if I play it, I'll put it here.
What you and Majid hope that audiences will get from conversations like this.
You all should really feel a part of the conversation. Everything you do on social media and comment threads and the kinds of conversations you have with colleagues and friends and coworkers, the things that you choose not to be silent about when they're said in front of you, all of that is indispensable in getting these kinds of ideas out there to those who are possible candidates to be persuaded by them. And so I would just encourage you to own your part of this and feel that this is really your project as well. It's not just me and Majid sitting up here. On the plane.
And it's at the end of the film. And so the film is based on the book between Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz having this very intellectual conversation that's pretty heady about Islam and the future of tolerance is the name of the film and the book, and gets into philosophy and politics about the relationship between Islam and violence, etc. Very complicated stuff. And as a filmmaker, it's an old trick in the hat that we always are sort of told and try to end the film on sort of a more positive note, or at least a call to action. Like you've just sat through this deep conversation about a very tricky topic, and maybe hopefully you learned something and you feel a bit smarter. But now, the number one question us filmmakers always get is, what do you do? And so I was looking for a clip of both of the men, Sam and Majid, maybe saying something a little more action oriented so you could leave the theater with something you do. And I used a clip of Sam. This is 2016 in January, where a clip when he was in Australia on stage with Majid answering a question from the audience. And so I just played it so you know, but he emphasizes basically that you in the audience listening to this conversation should feel a part of it. And he includes in that sort of your interaction on social media. He basically says, like if you're on social media and somebody sees just a deluge of responses to really bad ideas on something, in that case in particular about Islam and violence or something, it's helpful. And he ends the quote. It's a very nice quote. He says other things about like, it matters the kinds of things that you stay silent about when said in front of you. And that's very nice. But on social media, the etiquette, I don't know if it's changing or he's changed his thoughts from 2016. I'm curious how you think. And I have in mind a little interaction, which you may have seen with Candace Owens that he just had, who was a very, I find her just a really kind of awful character who's, feeding red meat to the right-wing base and has sort of this character she plays. Maybe it's genuine. I don't know, but spreads a lot of crap information. Is a very kind of vile character there. and tweeted this thing that was not necessarily calling coronavirus a hoax, but very much downplaying it and saying like this is an overblown media hype, and that's going to be the legacy of this thing. Sam called her out in a way that he hasn't done, honestly, in a long time, with people like calling people out directly and calling the tweet stupid and basically saying you should walk it back, something like that. And then had a phone call with her apparently, and then put out a tweet saying like, great to talk to you, be well, kind of thing. And she amended a little bit of what she said in this tweet and said something like, I don't even remember what she said, but she basically said like, practice social distancing. It was a good edit as far as like, if anybody was reading her first thing, and she has a large follower base, if anybody was reading her first thing and said, oh, this is a hoax, forget it, maybe they changed their behavior a little bit. So the obvious consequentialist math of people with large followings saying the right things at the moment is, obvious again to me, but I'm actually a little bit unsure at this point and we don't need to speak specifically about her that much unless you want to, or people like her, but I'm not sure what is the best course of action in a crisis when you're dealing with people who oftentimes, who have large followings and have an audience listening, are peddling harmful information. Should you degrade them and just like, get in little Twitter spats about them, or should you do what Sam tried to do? I actually don't know. I'm curious your thoughts. You have a bigger following than me. I don't know if you like it. I'm starting to view my small one as sort of a blessing. It's like I can say what I want. I don't care. But if I see Sam's dilemma there. If I had a big following, I would behave differently on there. You'd become a bit of a news agency yourself, which is I think a shit situation that we're in.
Yeah,
because we shouldn't. I'm not a news agency. Yeah.
So there are two questions. I guess they're in a way they're the same question. Like how should we look at our participation in social media, given that social media can be exciting and extremely terrifying and really toxic. And it can amplify all of like the petty kinds of anxiety that you want to escape if you're trying to live a happy life with your few years on Earth. So the way I look at this basically is the same way I look at U.S. foreign policy, which is, the reason I'm not I suppose a pacifist or an isolationist with U.S. foreign policy, meaning the reason I don't think we should just take our troops away from everywhere and say the world is the world's problem. Let's put America first and we'll retaliate if someone attacks us. But other than that, we're just battening down the hatches and keeping our troops home. The reason I don't agree with that is because, influence is wars are going to be fought whether we're in them or not. And if American troops aren't somewhere, they might just be replaced by Russians. And so you have to make the comparative, you have to ask the comparative question, which force is better, not which force is amazing or perfect. And the analogy to social media is just that if you don't occupy space with arguments, someone else will. The space is going to be occupied either way. And it's either going to be occupied by arguments that make more ethical sense or arguments that make less ethical sense. And so to abandon the stage completely is just to sort of allow people who, perhaps for reasons of confirmation bias or financial incentives or partisanship, are going to spread lies. Yeah. So it's kind of not an option to, I think, completely disengage. But I do view it as like a reluctant engagement. Yeah. It's not,
and do you think, I was going to say in a time of crisis, do you think the engagement changes or ought to change? Because just it's more important right now if Fox News, as much as I find it terrible, actually, amended their, like, it's two options. Do we try to get people to stop watching Fox News, or because we're like, look, they're lying to you. Why are you watching this? Don't go to a restaurant. I think today Ted Cruz said it's a great time for like healthy people to go to restaurants because there's plenty of tables. And it's like, that is so irresponsible for him to be saying, of course, and for Fox News to be broadcasting. So should the response be like writing letters to Fox News being like, oh, no, please actually tell people to social distance and like take this responsibility, seriously? Or is it to make fun of them and bash them and find Fox News watchers and get them to change the channel? It might just be a time thing. Like in a time of crisis, it's like, no, it's actually more important that even bad media starts to say nice, good things because it's life saving. There's like lives on the line. And then I guess like the frustration with that, if the answer to that is yes, which I kind of think it might be, obviously a lot of consequentialism would point that way, is it's not totally clean consequentialism, because then when this is not our last crisis. And then are you somehow legitimizing this person? Was Sam somehow legitimizing? I don't even know what the word really means there, but Candace, by engaging with her on a phone call or whatever, where the next crisis is just as bad. Is it much more important? And this is maybe a philosophical, a philosopher's kind of bias here, but we try to think of these things. And that's why we deal with these crazy hypotheticals and have these crazy conversations and have our podcast before the crisis starts. So we could think of these things, and the power of not calling out Fox News in normal times when the stakes are smaller, which I know has been done, but I don't know the answer to it. Maybe is the thing that led to the situation. You know how I feel about certain other characters who in particular propped up Candace or whatever. In fact, I think you, when you were sort of a rising star, asked me about going on Dave Rubin's show. And it was almost the same kind of calculus of like, listen, he's got a big audience, do what you want. Here's what I think about him. And I thought you did a great job. And it's always, you're not the only person who's asked me about that show or other people, because I just happen to have opinions and know a lot of these people. And I always give that same advice. I'm like, they have an audience. And so you could reach that audience. And if you think that audience is getting bad information, you could use this as an opportunity to inject and sprinkle in a little good stuff. That's always available, but it's only convincing even of myself to a certain degree.
You wouldn't take it to Alex Jones, would you?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. Because at some point you're like, it's actually not worth it. Like, where is the line where that argument I just gave breaks and you say like, no, actually the best thing to do is like ruthlessly mock this person and every person who watches it. It's not really my style. I'm not like a good internet troll that way, although I do get frustrated. I think Sam used to much more take that tact and now has backed off in a certain way. I don't know the line, honestly. Social media, it irritates me like crazy, but this particular question is one that always, and it seems to, we know the incentives within the machine itself align towards, we know which answer they want, which is, hey, fight everybody because it's more engagement. So we're up against it just with the algorithms as is. I don't know. I just threw a lot at you, but I can never find that line.
Yeah. So the idea that you legitimize people, is that a word? Legitimize?
It's used a lot.
I don't really see it that way, because so like Candace Owens, for example, I think many things she says are true about race, and I would agree with.
Right.
And other things she says are like Wikipedia false. Like you could find out that they're false in 2 seconds. Like, and I don't even know how serious she is, but she has seriously said things like Richard Spencer is a paid operative of the Democratic Party. Right. So like, okay, maybe she has access to some information that's going to come out 30 years from now in the biography of Richard Spencer in the archives, and will be like, wow, that's crazy. The time the DNC propped up this white supremacist but like, come on, that's very unlikely. Yeah. So things like that. There is with her a willingness to say things that are factually untrue and a seeming not feeling of the burden. On the other hand, she has a style of engagement that is really engaging for people. And she doesn't seem to me to be like completely crazy. She seems more like kind of like modeling herself after Ann Coulter, who's like, from what I hear, is a very sweet person in real life, but has a style of engagement that is half entertainment and half, or perhaps, 2/3 or 3/4 entertainment. and like 1/4 serious argument. And the idea can be that, you get a much wider audience by having the by maxing out on the entertaining half. And then whatever arguments you sneak in there, are probably having some greater effect. So if that's the style that, she thinks makes sense for her, then, what I worry about that is you just become so loose with facts.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't see, once you stop caring about what's true for entertainment purposes, you lose the right to complain against the people you claim to hate. The SJWs who have all of these false ideas. You kind of lose the intellectual high ground when you just say, yeah, global warming is a Chinese hoax. Everything Donald Trump does is great in principle. A priori, I'm not even going to, think about the idea that something he does might be bad. You just you lose the right to complain, in my opinion. But as for legitimating, I'm not. Yeah. Everyone is, all public intellectuals and people are some mix. No one is perfect, right?
Right.
And so how much better would Candace Owen have to be for you to say, okay, now she's worth talking to? I don't know. There's some line there, but it's not clear where that is. And, she seems sane enough that one could have a conversation with her. Right. Yeah. So I think that's all. I think it's all to the good that like Sam talked her and got her to slightly walk back from the cliff of saying, we're just going to freak out and crash the economy. And that's the only thing people are going to remember. This tweet will age well.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I guess like the legitimizing thing, maybe this is not how it's meant to be used there, but would be like, I don't know what small percentage of people who follow Sam had never heard of her, and now they have because of that conversation, and now they'll follow her, and then some small percent will be enraptured by her, not just false ideas, but just like terrible engagement and harmful ideas. I mean,
but then there's really, vice versa. Really how many Candace Owens fans discover Sam?
I hope. And maybe, although and then it's like we become, I put up like, behold, being held hostage by somebody's high follower account. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't saying it even snarkily. I'm like, I actually feel the hostage holding there of the high follower account. As a much, much less, like, we could get off the Candace thing. This is on a much less prickly example. I went on Morning Joe, the MSNBC show, which I think is a show that's like not great. I don't, I
was this for the documentary?
It was for the documentary. It was for an interview for it. And it wasn't like very combative. It was fine. I was super happy to be on it. But most of me being happy to be on it was also that they have a huge audience. And I was like, oh, cool. Like an opportunity to like maybe correct some of MSNBC viewers' moral relativism, as it turns out, that I, of course, am convinced is harmful to the people that they want to protect. I think the intentions are good, and I want to help give them some better things to think about in arguments or whatever. So, like, did I legitimize that show by going on it or whatever? Like, yeah, in some way. But yeah, it was that being held hostage by a large audience is a problem that is, beyond social media, but in a way has snuck into, like, Candace Owens doesn't have any qualifications. You know what I mean? Like, she's just a blogger who like caught some wave and there she is. But now she has this huge audience.
I mean,
it's like, then it's power.
So a few things about that.
Yeah.
One is, Fox News, MSNBC, these are all abstractions that contain, dozens or hundreds of different people. And those people run the gamut. Fox News has actual experts on, not just occasionally, but like with some frequency. Like the guy Sam Harris had on his podcast to talk about Corona said, I go on Fox all the time to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
So, if something is an important outlet, the question of whether it as a whole is legitimate or not, I don't think really can be answered, because, that question is going to be answered differently for like the worst moments of Hannity versus the more quality shows on Fox, and the same for MSNBC. We have this problem of partisanship and I think the even bigger problem of echo chambers and information cocoons and bubbles and whatnot, I think most people don't realize the degree to which they're in a bubble. So for example, I've been writing for Quillette, and I've written for the Wall Street Journal and did one for the New York Times. And often people in the world, in the circle that pay attention to those kinds of things, if I'm talking to them, they often ask me, wow, things must be crazy for you at Columbia, right? People must be coming up to you all the time and engaging your work and whatnot. And I say, no, nobody knows who I am. Nobody cares. Nobody's heard of Quillette. It's a very niche thing to care about. So the mistake people are making is failing to realize how much of a bubble they and others are in, and especially others.
Yeah. Especially others.
People would like to think that the wider world is paying attention to the things I'm doing, but the wider world is like in its own bubble, paying attention to like the things it's paying attention to.
Yeah.
And so I think, part of breaking that bubble is being willing to talk to people who are coming from a very different set of biases and perspectives than your own. There's not enough of that in my opinion. So I think it's on net. It's a good thing.
Yeah. And I wonder actually, like we can move towards the end of this conversation with good things, because I wonder, we're obviously very much in it. We're still on the upswing of a very steep curve when we're recording this. So we'll see how it plays out, but everyone's wondering what this is going to change in the future. People are calling it, a global event. Nothing will ever be the same. We'll see how that plays out, but there's something very, about a pandemic that cuts through a lot of bullshit and cuts through a lot of hoaxes and a lot of partisanship and a lot of posturing and virtue signaling, whatever we're going to call it, on every side, something that everybody does. It just cuts through it because it's getting to like base survival and something that is it doesn't care about borders, doesn't care about ethnicity. This thing just comes for you. It's a virus. It's like a blind thing. Donald Trump could call it a hoax all he wants, and
he might get it.
He's still, but he might get it. And like, there's something just that cuts through all of these bubbles that we have. Which demands, I think, hopefully a shift. Our bubbles, and maybe our. I want to bring this to a conversation about what's going to change, and I wonder if this populist nationalist kind of wave that we've been seeing is going to suffer a little bit. I think Steven Pinker wrote something about this actually. Under something like the situation of coronavirus, which just seems to demand global cooperation in order to combat it, because it just doesn't care. The thing doesn't know when it crosses a border. And so the borders that we care about and protect are important, clearly. But I wonder, do you think this is going to change any of the bigger conversations?
So there's a counter argument to that, which was made by Pat Buchanan, which goes something like this. Coronavirus is actually going to do the opposite. It's going to make the case for nationalism for us because, a few considerations. One, because of globalization, we've outsourced, we've allowed China to develop a virtual monopoly on the production of vaccines, for example, so that when we do get a coronavirus vaccine, if the Chinese government wants to, it can say, we're going to vaccinate everyone in China first, then the West, you can get the leftovers. So that means, we're waiting however long for 1 billion vaccines to be, developed in China, and they have the right to sort of prioritize themselves. And why did we allow them to get that monopoly in the first place? Because it was a bit cheaper. Another argument would be, do we want all of Mexico, when they're infected with the virus, coming to America? Not just because we're afraid of getting it from them. I mean, we should be afraid of getting it from our neighbors first, but because they're going to want American healthcare. Say what you want about American healthcare, but we're basically the best in the world at like acute intensive care. We're really bad at like long-term diseases and whatnot. But at acute care, like you got shot or you're going into cardiac arrest or, you know, your respiratory system is shutting down, the American system is unusually good at dealing with cases like that. And do we want, you know, Mexicans flooding the border, you know, trying to get U.S. healthcare? So is that not kind of making the case for nationalism? You know, it might end up being a wash. It might not end up doing much at all. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Marginally, it might just
definitely the case.
I was just saying, marginally, it might just benefit Trump. You know, if we get out of it not totally scathed, he'll seem like a presidential leader. You know, like in times of war, you look to the president to like for you don't want change. I don't know. We'll see.
Maybe. Yeah. If it's still raging at that, if there's an election, when there's an election. Yeah. Although I think the response has just been so dreadful that not to make it partisan, but just a monumental failure on the part of the federal government, which he's going to have to walk his way out of. I'm sure he'll try, and I'm sure his 40% will follow him right out of it. But yeah, no, with the nationalism thing, I see the argument for pointing out how an interconnected world is a more vulnerable world, because if one part of the machine breaks, the whole thing breaks. Like the supply chains, if China is shut down, all over the world are in trouble, because almost everything has a part that's made in China. Like you get the obvious, like, oh, it would be great if everybody was sort of self-reliant on an island. Yeah, I could see that argument being made, but if you keep playing that one out, again, diseases, like they don't care. No matter how isolated you are, they're going to spread. Like it doesn't take much for it to start, you know, populating in another, across another border. So I think playing out the nationalism one you might be right that it goes that way. I guess we'll just have to see, but is terrible and leads to, like, I mean, this brings back sort of, I know we wanted to end on the good stuff, but the moral responsibility, we talked about, like reckless endangerment of patient 31, Florida suing China is funny, but I actually wonder if this kind of thing, you brought it to somewhere like the ICJ, and you were claiming it's not even a bad argument, a legal argument. And I am not an international lawyer. I did a film about it and I learned a little, but I'm not an international lawyer. But an argument seems to be able to be made of like a legal / moral responsibility for a place that knows it has a thing that is a global threat and mismanages it so badly and recklessly endangers the rest of the world, which it did, causing all kinds of death and mayhem. I mean, you play this indirect responsibility game long enough and it just disappears into nothing. But if you can start tracing the line fairly, you know, straight, there were legal criminal cases that I believe were found almost unanimously guilty of people who knew they had the AIDS virus, having unprotected sex and infecting others, who were prosecuted and found guilty for doing so. I think even at like second degree murder kind of charges, I could check that. The analogy here on a country sort of doing that kind of thing is, if not legally sound, kind of morally interesting to consider. And when I play out that nationalism game, are we going to enter a world where we're like going to war with, because the problem with a pandemic is you really can't have outliers. You need it's either like it's global cooperation, either all in the extreme of a global cooperation. Robin Hansen's second reference was talking about like world government and that kind of thing. Or it's global cooperation, meaning we're all going to globally decide to be nationalistic. You almost have to go one way or the other, because if you go almost all the way but have one outlier, the way pandemics work, the one outlier can cause the corruption of the entire system. Like, are we going to go to war with countries that don't handle their pandemics properly and allow it to escape, as it were? Like, who has the responsibility? The guy letting the person get on the plane, or the country accepting the guy on the plane? I want to say both, and we all need to cooperate in some kumbaya world. We just know that's maybe my lefty pipe dream. I don't know.
Yeah. As far as like suing people for this kind of thing, I think that's so, like, why stop at China? Why not sue the meat market at Wuhan? And there's definitely a huge element of moral luck there, which is, if I got corona now and spread it, or like let's say I what separates the first person to get coronavirus morally from the last person to get it? Well, in pure consequentialist terms, the first person is the reason that it spread to like maybe 3 billion, right? Like just because they were in that position, whereas the last person spreads it to nobody because you happen to be the last person. The first person to get the AIDS virus is in some sense responsible for the whole thing, but they're in another sense the unluckiest, the morally unluckiest, because they were in a position to spread it to 7 billion people. And I there does seem to be something unfair about holding China responsible for spreading it to the world. I mean, because, all things considered, the Chinese government, they flubbed in the beginning because they tried to suppress it and spread disinformation, from what I understand. But when they did respond, they responded, with full force, which was certainly a good thing.
Crazy force.
And probably responded much better than the American federal government has responded. So, I don't really feel any antipathy towards China because of this. They're a country that 40 years ago was like a completely third world. And they still have many parts of China that are just really like rural backwaters. And I definitely think they should stop wolfing down bat burgers in Wuhan, in that one meat market.
I think it was a pangolin, which is an animal I didn't even know existed before this thing, which is very adorable. The pangolin, by the way. Yeah. Not food. So
should definitely get rid of those crazy live meat markets, which seem to be like breeding grounds for super viruses. But other than that, I think it's bad luck that this thing came out of China. I don't think it's something you sue over.
I'm gonna say something to shift this. I totally agree, actually, and I'm gonna shift this in a way that I think is really where I want to end it. Again, of course, with my favorite thinker, David Deutsch. But to really drive home, there was this line that we talked about in his episode of all evil is caused due to lack of knowledge, and this obvious, and that was the one you brought up. I think the coronavirus, when it was just sort of creeping in on us, and this is a situation of. I think when he talks about something like the climate crisis, of course, the word crisis there is really interesting to talk about philosophically, what that means and what is the crisis when you're talking the climate crisis. Of course, you can say like, well, the temperature is rising and talk about greenhouse gases and climate change and all the science that people hopefully know by now is happening. And that's the crisis and we're driving it. Well, sure. But another way to actually describe the crisis is that because we don't have a solution for it, it's affecting our behavior in drastic ways. It's not letting us do what we want and live the kind of lives we want. We're having to sacrifice. This word sacrifice is used in religious philosophy a lot as this like great thing, but he almost flips it in this way of like, no, sacrifice is terrible. Like, why do you have to sacrifice that thing? We could set aside the psychological utility of sacrifice, but philosophical sacrifice is actually kind of awful. It's like, oh, that means you're in a crisis if you're being asked to sacrifice something. Little things like, using metal straws instead of paper, whatever, let's not cry about it. But major things, if the climate crisis becomes so big that we're like rationing our gasoline and how far we could travel and flying to beautiful places that we can't do now because of that's actually the crisis, is that it made us change our behavior, which sounds a little kind of wacky, but stick with me there. So we need to solve that crisis. And once we have the solution for something like climate change, you can go back to flying wherever you want. If it's something as, cleaning the air with nano robots and we can regulate the temperature as easily as we regulate the temperature in this apartment, then the crisis is over, meaning go back to pursuing beautiful things and fly to those places you always wanted to, and et cetera. The crisis that we're in with a pandemic is clearly not good enough knowledge of how to combat disease and not just change our behavior in order to flatten the curve. That's like flattening the curve is another mathematical way of saying like sacrifice a lot of what you want to do because we need to do this because this is the best solution we have on the shelf right now. I hope that is viewed as the crisis. Of course, yes, people are dying, that's the obvious crisis, and people are getting sick, and that's the crisis. But think of the crisis in a way of like, we should change our behavior because of those things. But the fact that we're being asked to sacrifice and ought to morally sacrifice in major ways is the crisis. And hopefully this is a situation that we all go through as earthlings living through the year 2020 and what is clearly a global moment of this pandemic, of realizing just so saliently that our knowledge of how to beat and fight disease is not good enough, because we're being asked to sacrifice way too much in order to mitigate moral situations that ought not to exist, like 1% of all the old people in the world dying, and they all happen to be old. Like, that's not tenable. So we're all trying to change our behavior. That's the crisis we're in. So I hope and we should be cheering on our scientists and celebrating when we have a cure. This is, I've pointed out before, whenever that we do solve this thing, because there's also sort of this fun, I think, thing to notice, that we all have this kind of optimism that we all just say like, oh, when are they going to get the vaccine? The fact that we can kind of reliably ask that question because we know we're good at least that part of it, and that we'll get it in a year or two, whatever it is. It's kind of amazing, like how amazing would have that been during the Black Plague for people to be like, oh, when are the scientists getting the vaccine? Like, this is kind of shitty. Like, I hate staying inside. We're at that point, but we want more, and that's great. Science and knowledge collection should be even better. I don't know exactly what that looks like here because we don't have that knowledge yet. And I also just want to point towards another Deutschian point here of while I'm on this kind of hopefully energetic and positive rant, is a play for, we don't know where that knowledge will come from. And the kind of mocking that people have done in the past of pure scientific research. I actually have a list of things that mostly Republican, but also Democrat congressmen have pointed out on the floors of the Senate before, of mocking like wasteful government spending, such as studying steroid use in hamsters, cocaine's effects on the sexual activity of Japanese quails, methane gas, see, you laugh, but there you go. Methane gas from dairy cows. Why
is that crazy?
What was this? What the method? Yeah, well, at the time they made fun of it, right? Because no one really completely understood the effects of climate change. It's a perfect example of that one. Without complete knowledge, the knowledge that we have of the damage would be mocked of like, you're studying cow farts, like our government is wasting money. Actually, no, that's a hugely important thing to study, when it may have been seen as a fringe crazy scientist who had some theory about the effect of cow farts on the environment. That's fair. And how big it was.
Before I knew that was important, I might have mocked it too.
And they did. This was like a clip from the 80s. If I can find it, I can put it up. And then imagine someone like mocking pangolin mating habits or something like 5 years ago. It's totally mockable in that sense, but actually could have been the thing of understanding the immune system of the pangolin. Who knows where you will find the knowledge that could have been the thing that turned the key and stopped this thing and saved a lot of lives. That we should just be championing science.
Point taken. Point taken. But what about the giving Japanese quails Coke? Is that plausibly related to anything?
I didn't read the full study. It was cocaine's effects on sexual activity. I think it was trying to study, obviously, human behavior.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say the quails have more sex when they're on Coke, and then they want more Coke after you give them Coke first.
I don't know. I should link to the study. You could read it. But this is the thing with pure science. Some of them will be dead ends. But one of 100, and you just don't know which one could be the one. I'm sure they were studying, of course, the Japanese quail might have some, listen, if there's a scientist out there who knows that one, I'm sure they'll be in touch being like, this is why I did it. And I'm bet it
we need
makes
to
sense.
give penguins Viagra and meth and see what happens.
Yeah.
For science.
Just to see, for science. Do it for science.
Here's one thing though I want to say about the coronavirus. Did you read Yasha Monk's piece about what's happening in Italian hospitals with the triage system that they have to?
No.
The basic outline is that all of their hospitals are operating at overcapacity, and not just a little bit overcapacity, like something like twice capacity. Oof. Twice as many people need intensive care units as they have. So they're having to put in this triage system, deciding who to take and who to leave to die.
Oh, yeah, there you
Which
go.
is horrible.
Which is the episode we did with Lisa Tessman about Katrina, after Katrina in the hospitals and you're running out of resources. Yeah, go ahead.
And so this is a moral philosopher's morbid fantasy, which is what rules do they use to triage people? And it turns out the rules they're using are sort of straight out of utilitarian thinking. They're if they're trying to essentially maximize the life years saved.
They're just going youngest to oldest.
Yeah, so
letting the oldest die.
Yeah, so if you come in and you're 65, and you have one intensive care units, you have one person who's 30. Let's say they have a 50% chance of recovery if you give them the intensive care unit, and someone who's 65, they have a 30% chance of recovery.
Yeah. They
let the old person die in the hallway and give it to the 30-year-old. And
yeah,
what this made me think is that, regardless of what very esoteric arguments you and I might have about deontology and utilitarianism, when it comes down to it, utilitarian thinking has very much won. It's won in some fundamental way.
Well, it wins in a crisis. I mean, I agree with you.
It wins in a crisis,
and maybe in a fundament. It wins in a crisis, and I hate it, but I agree with you that it wins.
Yeah.
I hate when you're forced to use it, and I agree with you. You're forced to use it there.
You're also right that the goal should be to engineer ourselves out of such dilemmas so that we don't.
Yeah.
Italy failed. The fact that it has to use this triage system is evidence that it failed at something.
Yes, and so to wrap this one up with that, because that's the famous the trolley problem is terrible, because yes, when you're forced to just do the math, all things being equal, do the math, but someone's going to die. And if you could avoid being on that track somehow, that was my whole just rant and pitch there for science, cheering on science. I also wanted to add with the cheering on science, I hope one day when we do better with this, and it will be soon, we'll celebrate it, because while this was going on, I jumped into some conversations to remind people there was literally a video of doctors in Congo celebrating on the streets, banging jerry cans, that the last Ebola patient had left the entire country. And Ebola, we basically solved it. I don't want to overplay it, but we have a semi-cure that is no longer a death sentence, which is crazy. Within a few years, if you remember the Ebola scare and craze, we solved that, and no one was walking around the streets high-fiving solving Ebola. And I think we need more of that, maybe to wrap back in sort of the shame and celebration and what we could do about engineering and hijacking people's status seeking. We should be making heroes out of the people who fight these things and solve these things, because they're genuine heroes. And with your sentence there of like, we should avoid being on the tracks of the trolley. We should avoid these situations where we're forced to use utilitarianism and consequentialism math. I guess utilitarianism in that case. Right now, to end this one, it seems that the train is coming for us. We already made a lot of mistakes by avoiding it, and we could blame federal government or whatever, but we're on the tracks now. And so if anybody has listened to this and needs just any general advice, of course, it's the best we can do, given all of that and the knowledge we have on the shelf, is wash your hands, social distancing, read a good book, listen to podcasts, and do I don't know. That's my advice. Do the best you can, and try to internalize the kind of invisible responsibility that we've talked about here. For people of our age group, and likely the ones who will be listening to us of the age group, I know the biggest fear is not getting sick. I'm not actually that worried about dying from the disease or getting sick. I'm not but what we should be. So buying hand sanitizer and all that and that craze, I feel like is a little kind of skewed almost. It's like, don't worry about getting it so much. Worry about giving it. Worry about.
That's the other thing I wanted to mention, is that I think it's interesting, and it would be interesting to be somewhere like South Korea, to know which countries frame the public health response more in terms of how to not get it, and which countries frame it in terms of how to not give it. And in America, of course, it's all about how to not get it. There's almost no conversation about how to not give it. I mean, there's the proportion of information that's about how to not get it to how to not give it is super high, right? The ratio.
It's a huge
and I just
point.
wonder if that's universal or if that's very different in other countries.
Yeah, I think it reveals something a little ugly about the individualism of America. I mean, that's a topic we didn't really talk much specifically about, but the differences of cultural memes in places like Korea or China that are more collectivist versus individual, and which ones are faring better, quote unquote, in this situation. And our individualism and our rampant libertarianism in America may be our worst enemy in some regards there. But I think it does reveal something a little ugly about ourselves. And I think we need, it's fine. The individualism is fine, works great in market systems. But we should be, yes, I think there needs to be a shift, especially if you're young. Think about who you're giving it to and the indirect kind of, it might not be your grandmother, but it might be the person you hung out with, their grandmother when they go hang out with them. So yeah, hand sanitizer is good and all that, whatever. But think about not giving it for as long as we can.
And
there you go.
Finally, what are the best bingeable shows? We should give people some recommendations.
Oh, I've been, I'm a huge Roseanne fan. It's still my favorite show of all time.
Right.
And you don't know
I've never seen it, I think.
Oh, it's 9 seasons long. It's still on Amazon Prime for free. My girlfriend has not seen all of it, so I have her almost. She's at the season finale of season 4, so she's got 4 more seasons to go. Although the last ones aren't very good. There's that one. I'm not a huge TV watcher. I did see Westworld is coming out again.
Yeah, when is that coming out?
Season 1 is. I don't know. I saw the ads on buses.
I'm ready recently, for that.
But Westworld season 1 is like the best TV I've ever seen. Season 1 just is.
Season 2 is good too.
Flawless.
I thought.
Yeah.
Season 2 was good.
I want to make a pitch with the bingeable thing. There's 2 services that I've looked at while we're spending a lot more home time that are all science documentaries and more philosophy stuff that probably a lot of our audience is into. One's called Magellan TV that you should check out. And the other one's Curiosity Stream, which is a little more popular. They're both cool. They're subscription based, but it's they're great. So I signed up for a free trial and watching sciencey documentaries and that kind of stuff. Watch my film. Hey, Islam and Future Tolerance. It's on there. It's on Amazon Prime.
Nice.
I don't know what else you got. I watched Contagion.
Yeah, everyone's watching that. I hear it's good. I might watch it.
It's a great film. I saw it in the theater years ago. Yeah.
I think
The Stand. Stephen King's The Stand is my favorite post-apocalyptic plague movie.
Okay.
So if you want to really freak yourself out, The Stand is pretty great. Yeah.
Things I find very bingeable are House. The old Hugh Laurie, Death Note, one of the best animes and super bingeable. Westworld, the OA I found very bingeable. Louis.
Yeah, comedy is good if you need a laugh. Also, I'll say I don't know if you've been getting into this at all. I'm totally on board with the board game renaissance that's happening.
Is it?
So it's got a few really good board games.
Yeah, I'm not on that train. But is there a renaissance?
Oh, yeah, a little bit. There's really beautiful games getting made. So I just played Takedo for the first time last night, which was it's semi-competitive Japanese vacationing. It's a really fun board game. You come over and we'll play it. It actually gets your mind off
social distancing, man.
Nah, we're good.
I'm not coming anywhere near you.
And everything. we could actually probably play it virtually. Hive is a game that's really fun. This sort of chess checkerboard game that we've been playing a lot of. Get into board games. They're great. Go get a board game.
Nice. All right.
I don't know. Be safe, everyone. So yeah, and in social distancing spirit, we did this one via Skype. So do a lot more of that. Video conferencing. It's the only stock that's up on the stock market.
Yeah, Zoom is killing it right now.
They're killing it now. The conspiracy was probably them. So there you go. That's it. So that was our little coronavirus special. Be safe, everyone.
All right.
Yeah. Be well. All right. Take it easy.
Peace.
See you, man.
See ya.